In the world of fantasy universes, one might easily get lost in the whimsical environment, with all the mystical beings, undiscovered cultures, and magic to be wielded. No matter the universe you might have gotten lost in, one might think to themselves, it would be really cool to be there. And then there is the Warhammer universe. No one ever wants to be there. But truth be told, the vast majority of fantasy worlds have a twist. Yes, it would be cool to commune with spirits and tinker with the magical inventions. But in order for a fantasy world to be interesting, it needs to be dangerous. I mean, if people are not fighting, there is no action. And so, that brings up a totally different thought. Yes, it would be cool to be there, but could you actually survive there? You see, in real life, our planet Earth has what is called the Global Peace Index. It is a pretty good number that can approximate the safety of every individual country. Which made me think. Runeterra is also split into regions that kinda behave like countries. They have their own cultures and hazards. Can we calculate the Global Peace Index of Runeterra? Well, it turns out you can, kind of. All the Global Peace Index is the level of hazards and economics, the level of conflicts, including death count during the conflicts, crime rate and political instability, perception of criminality, military the size of their military, and all of that is normalized on a scale. Meaning that if you roughly know all of these indicators, you can, at the very least, compare them. The issue, however, is that the Global Peace Index is aiming at Earth specifically, meaning that they have 23 different indexes, but some of them are about nuclear weapons, which could be related to the Rune Wars, but also stuff like the perception of criminality, which is purely based on the relationships between humans. It does not take into account the environment itself trying to kill you. So surprisingly, a lot of these stats just don't apply to Runeterra. But the rest of them, those can be shoved into the big 3 index categories. And those can be compared. And so, we did just that with a single goal. In case you get isekai'd into Runeterra, where should you go? For this specific setup, let's start in an ascending order. So we'll start with the safest places, and then we will progressively go into the more dangerous ones. But even here, even as we look at the most peaceful land, it is not exactly as flawless as you would think. So, let's start with Ionia. At first sight, you would expect this to be a very calm place. I mean, the entire idea of Ionia is that if you don't hurt nature, the nature spirit is not gonna hurt you. But the catch is that the nature spirit can be irritated by someone else, and you can be caught in the crossfire. Not to mention, the circle of life is still a thing, so even if you don't bother anyone, if you just happen to be in the wrong territory, well, something will try to eat you. And so, to simplify our approach, today we will be looking at 3 big indexes. Is there a conflict, either internal or external? How good is the social security? And is there militarization? And in the case of Ionia, sadly, yes, there is conflict, both internal and external. You see, after Borem Darkwill launched the invasion of Ionia, suddenly Noxians were occupying the land. And as they did, they really managed to anger the spirits. Which means, suddenly, Ionia was not safe for anyone. This also kickstarted some internal conflicts. Because while most people stayed very traditional and they believe that it is a very Ionian way to just stay passive, because eventually nature would equal everything out, while other people believed that it was a little bit too much for nature to handle. And so they wanted to take things into their own hands. So ever since this invasion started, the people of Ionia were split into 2 halves. Those who fought and those who didn't. And these 2 sides just never saw eye to eye. But thankfully, eventually the Ionians did push Noxians out, for the most part, and very slowly the land started healing again. So despite that being a really rough time for the continent, over time, the peace index did start to calm down. And so, in the present days specifically, the level of conflict would be very low. That is, on the normalized scale of Runeterra. Remember that. But what about the social security and safety? Well, if you happen to be in one of the towns in Ionia, the chances are you're pretty safe. I mean, the vast majority of the continent is gonna be very peaceful. But again, it is not exactly flawless. Even after the invasion, there is gonna be some Kinku duking it out with the Shadow Order. We might have some maniacs running around. And yes, there's even gonna be political instability. Because while previously no one really cared about who's in charge of Ionia, well, now that people decided that people should be in charge, someone should be in power. Not to mention, some of the Navori agents are still kidnapping people and recruiting them into their order. And that is all for the good of the rebellion. But the funny thing is, even if you take all of that into account, once again, normalized across the levels of Runeterra, the safety of Ionia is pretty good. I guess we'll see what comes next. Lastly, we should also talk about the militarization, and it should be mentioned that most of Navori is ready to fight. And yes, some of the smaller islands around Ionia are still occupied by Noxus, so people will be fighting there. But again, on the global level, it's pretty good. But as we mentioned, Runeterra also has this thing called the wilderness, so overall, should you drop into Ionia, stick to one of the towns and avoid the wilds. Because not only may you stumble into a territory of a Vastayan tribe that might try to hunt you down, because a lot of those tribes don't like humans, but it is also possible that you might find a demon or two around. So just sit in a town, live your happy life, and pray that you are not gonna find a maniac. Outside of that, you're gonna be good. And so after Ionia, let's step things up just a tiny bit. Because for the next one, let's go into Ishtal. Now, Ishtal is very interesting because on paper, this might be the safest place on Runeterra. Long story short, this is a nation of elemental mages where a lot of powerful mages used to go to study magic. But one day, their neighbor called the Kingdom of Ikathia decided to summon the void upon the world. And in doing so, they kinda started the apocalypse. Of course, since Ishtal is right next to them, they helped in the fight against the void. They realized there wasn't much they could do, and so they did the only logical thing. They completely isolated themselves from the rest of the world. So they brought up massive walls of plants around their kingdom, and they sat in their happy little bubble. And that is what all the safety is based around. If you happen to drop here, it's kinda the same thing as Ionia. Avoid the wilds. Especially here, since everything here is infused with elemental magic. If you find a random living plant, you're likely dead. What's worse, at least in Ionia, the creatures and the spirits try to live in harmony. Here, it's just pure survival instincts. And even worse than that, if you happen to step too far from the Ishtali civilization, you might find one of the hunting Vastayan tribes. And same thing as Ionia, most of these really don't like humans. Luckily for you though, the Ishtali civilization is very advanced. And you will soon realize that everything here is based on elemental magic. The downside is that you are not a mage, so you will not be able to use most of the inventions, but at least you'll be safe. And so plugging Ishtal into the peace index. When it comes to conflicts, for the most part, there are two. After Ikathia was destroyed by the Void, that entire landscape is crawling with the Voidborn. And some of these Voidborn might occasionally get into the jungles of Ishtal. And at the same time, from the north, you might see Piltover invaders who travel to the jungles of Ishtal to harvest wood. Which of course the Ishtali are not too happy about. But again, despite these two semi-minor conflicts, this is a pretty chill nation. And neither of the two conflicts are realistically gonna affect you. So then, what about the social safety? Well, here it is safe to assume that crime is gonna be very low. Because since you're in a bubble, if you do something bad, there is a pretty low chance you're gonna escape. But also, since the society is pretty advanced, there is no real reason to even commit crimes. However, with the recent events of Kiana taking to the throne, there is heavy political instability. You see, when Kiana was put in charge, she brought in a new vision. Instead of staying in a bubble, Kiana wants Ishtal to open up and reveal its glory again. Which is something the more traditional people are not gonna appreciate. So now you have people who don't believe in Kiana and who would rather stay with the traditions, meaning there is a pretty good chance there might be some kind of uprising. On top of which, let's talk about Skarner. Skarner is the giant protector of Ishtal that is all about traditions. He really doesn't want Ishtal to be opened because he wants to protect it against the void at all cost. And so, while the cities and the towns of Ishtal are gonna be very safe, give it a few years and we might be talking about a completely different story. But even with all of that, at least for now, the social safety is gonna be pretty good. Lastly, when it comes to the militarization, there is something happening since Kiana is rallying people, but so far she's only venturing outside of the borders on her own with a small group of her followers. She is keeping it pretty safe, and so not much is happening for now. And so overall, this is a pretty safe region. And speaking of regions where things are good for now, let's talk about Demacia. So I wouldn't be surprised if many of you chose Demacia as their Runeterran vacation. I mean, overall, this looks like a decent place. It's just a good old medieval kingdom where everyone takes care of each other. But the twist is that they take care of each other because they really want to survive. If you happen to drop here, my advice would be stay around the capital. Maybe not necessarily inside the capital though. Because if you know anything about the Demacian history, you'd know that during the Mage Rebellion there were a lot of mages who hated anyone who was even remotely close to the capital. And so the sweet spot would be close to the capital, but more importantly, far from the borders. If you stick to these rules, you might have a good time. But when it comes to the ongoing conflicts, things are not gonna be great. Depending on what time we are talking about, there could be potentially one internal conflict. That, of course, would be the Mage Rebellion. This was a big civil war where the people who hated mages fought against mages. But of course, by the end of the rebellion, the Mage Seekers were dispersed, and the entire situation was de-escalated. I mean, the prince is literally in love with a dragon, goddammit. But yes, this was a period of time where it was not fun to be Demacian. Now, outside of these, Demacia has two external conflicts. Of course, they are constantly facing the expansion of Noxus coming from the east. But they are also constantly facing the northern invaders of the Freljord, where the Freljordians pillage Demacia purely for survival. Because of these two, the levels of conflicts are sitting on a mid-level. It is not ideal, but it is a situation that Demacia can handle pretty well. But then, what about the social safety? Again, assuming we are outside of the rebellion, the Demacian society has always been very stable. I mean, it is really a medieval kingdom that is ruled by a king that only wants the best for his people. Sure, it might not be perfect, but they are trying. And so, even the crime rates are gonna be exactly what you would expect in a medieval kingdom. But what's worse, Demacia has a lot of other kinds of violence. Despite the general Demacian fauna not being that dangerous for the citizens, you might find the occasional witch terrorizing a village, you might find a dragon coming down from the mountains, and you might find the occasional magical beast in the northern mountains. And so, as I mentioned, stay away from the borders. And that's also because, most importantly, you'll find a lot of demons around Demacia. We're talking about Evelyn and Nocturne and Fiddlesticks, and who knows, potentially, there might also be Shaco now. And so, even if you think everything is fine, one day you might get jumped by a demon while you sleep. And so, when it comes to being secure here, Demacia is fine, but there is a lot of risks. And lastly, when it comes to military, ooh boy is Demacia really trying to push back the invaders. But a crucial distinction here is that Demacia are not the ones attacking. They are only protecting themselves, which does actually bring the rating down. And so overall, Demacia is not bad. And so, moving on, let's step things up as we get into Piltover and Zaun. Now yes, this is gonna be quite a big step up, because as people are aware from Arcane, the situation here is not great. By now people will know that being in Piltover, good. Being in Zaun, pretty bad. And so, why don't we just choose to stay in Piltover? Well, the thing is, you can't. Let's assume that we would be dropped in the middle of Piltover. What would you do? Could you find a job somewhere? Maybe. Could you find a shelter somewhere? Likely not. Which of course means that you would be homeless in Piltover. And if you are homeless in Piltover, there is a good chance you're getting thrown down into Zaun. And once you're in Zaun, you're screwed. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, let's talk about the conflicts. As Ambessa showed us in Arcane, Because Piltover is a very progressive city, there is a good chance other nations might be interested in it. Mainly, their northern Noxian neighbor is constantly trying to get inside. In Arcane, that is exactly what happened with Mbessa and Mel, but even before that, we got plenty of stories where Noxians planted their agents inside the Piltover houses. Meaning that while there may not be any conflicts that are obvious at first, Piltover is constantly in danger from the shadows. On top of this, as we mentioned, when they are not repelling Noxians, they are adventuring to the south to steal wood from Ishtal. So in a way, Piltover is also the aggressor. And because Piltover is a big trade city, you'll have a lot of noise from the questionable traders of Shurima and Bilgewater. But despite those, surprisingly, the level of conflict here is not that bad. It is really just the Noxians that are the main issue. And that's mostly because Piltover has its own issues with Zaun. And so you can expect the social safety to take a step back. Again, as you might have learned from Arcane, Piltover and Zaun have gone through civil wars many times in the past. And even in the present days, things are still not clear. On top of which, from the champions that have their stories happening after Arcane, we know that in the future, things are not gonna be any better. First, there was the civil war that separated Piltover from Zaun. During Arcane, there was the uprising of the Camp Barons. This then happened on top of Noxians starting to invade. And even after Arcane ended, we got more Camp Barons who are still doing bad things there. Meaning that when it comes to the social safety and security, there is almost none. And that's gonna be happening for the foreseeable future. And this is no matter if you are in Piltover or Zaun. Even if you are high above the city, there are gonna be scoundrels from Zaun stealing stuff from Piltover. And as was shown, even in the safety of the noble houses, Zaunites are not gonna be stopped. And so, nobody is really safe. And then of course, we also have to talk about the militarization. I mean, ever since the events of Arcane, Piltover does have some self-defense. It is nothing too crazy, but it is not as big as something like Demacia. But just like them, they are also trying to use it only for self-defense. And so, as you can see, if Piltover ironed out their relationship with Zaun, this would be a pretty good place to stay in. But as it is right now, I would not recommend it for a vacation. Just like how I would not recommend Shurima. Interestingly enough, despite Shurima's history being full of awful things, including slavery, we are gonna be talking about present Shurima. And the thing is, even there things are pretty bad. We are talking about a massive desert that is full of dangerous things. From the swarming Voidborn to the raiders to the weird creatures of the desert. And even if you happen to stumble on a city somewhere around the desert, it is gonna be full of thieves and warlords. And that is for one reason. Even though Azir was resurrected, he's not exactly ruling Shurima. At least yet. He is trying to kickstart something around the Sundisk again, but not much is happening. And so, every city will still have laws of their own. But because every city is now every man for himself, how does that play into the global conflicts? Well, even if Shurima is not exactly a united nation now, they still have Noxians constantly expanding into Shurima from the north, with some Shuriman port cities already being taken over. After which we have also Targon in the west. Now, Targon itself is not actually hostile, but right below the mountain there is Neremazeth, a place where Zerath is constantly trying to bring up a new empire with his fanatics. And once they get rolling, that's gonna be very bad news for the rest of Shurima. Then in the south you have the Icathian wasteland that is full of the Voidborn. Of course, next to that there is now Ishtal trying to get out into the world. And most importantly, the Voidborn situation got so bad they are now all over the desert. So if you just get out there into the desert, you're gone. Either from the raiders or the Voidborn or a good old starvation. So if you are in a Shuriman city, you are likely being taken advantage of by the warlords, or it is a matter of time before you get stabbed. And outside of these cities, it is inhabitable. So Shurima is just not a great place to stay. Of course, when it comes to the social safety and security, simply said, there is none. If there is no government, there is nobody to take care of you. But you know, at the very least, there is little to no militarization. At least, that is until Zerath makes progress towards Azir. Then it's bad news for everyone. So long story short, don't come here. That's the message. But of course, for a lot of these nations, the culprit is Noxus. So, let's talk about them now. On paper, Noxus is not that horrible. It is a nation where everyone is accepted, where everyone is given a job, where everyone has a place in the community. You know, communism. But also, Noxus likes to conquer a lot. Meaning there is a good chance you might just end up on the front lines. But Noxus doesn't really do this out of greed. The truth is that the Noxian soil is not exactly fertile. And so they have to conquer the surrounding areas for survival. Now sure, during the reign of the Borem Darkwill, perhaps he did go mad and he did start the invasion of Ionia, which was kinda full of greed. But in the modern days, if you ignore all the black magic around the capital, or the Black Rose doing really questionable stuff around the Empire, you're gonna be blessing Swain for calming the nation down. And so, when we have a look at the ongoing conflicts of Noxus, the truth is that nobody wants to fight Noxus. Noxus just fights everyone. They attack the Freljord with Darius in the lead. They attack Demacia through countless assassination attempts. They already conquered the port cities of Shurima. They are constantly trying to expand into Piltover. And let's not even talk about Ionia. Against all odds, they just don't really want to do anything in Bilgewater. Though they are definitely using the black market of Bilgewater. But yes, when it comes to the conflicts, things are pretty bad. So what about the social safety and security? Well, security? Absolutely. Again, unless you happen to cross an assassin from one of the noble houses, or the Black Rose, you're likely gonna be taken care of. When it comes to safety though, these noble houses are merciless. And whenever a house is beyond Swain's vision, they will do anything to get some more power. After all, this is a nation that's all about conquering. And so yes, when it comes to Noxus, I would stick to the outskirts of the capital. You shouldn't see too much noble activity there. And you'll be mostly sticking to the farming, where you can't really grow much. But at least you'll be protected by a really big army. Which means, we don't have to talk about militarization, right? And so, mainland Noxus? Not terrible, but it is just a ticking bomb that is waiting for you to be dragged onto the front lines. And so, looking at the situation so far, one might wonder, well, since all the nations are pretty bad, what if you decide to avoid the big nations? What if we just go somewhere else? Well then, you would have Nazuma. You see, Nazuma is a city-state that's in the southern part of the Shuriman continent. Here, the city was built by the people who wanted to escape the tyranny of the Shuriman Empire. Ever since then, the people lived in peace. Peace being very relative. You see, when it comes to the ongoing conflicts, this nation is really good. Most people don't know they exist, and when they exist, nobody really cares. And at the same time, Nazuma doesn't want to attack anyone either. However, there is this small thing being, you know, the end of the universe that's neighboring them. But worse than that, when it comes to their own securities, that's where the issues pile up. We're talking about an isolated nation, one that has very limited resources. In fact, as was mentioned in Cassante's bio, most of their resources were blocked off either by the ruthless predators or by the warlords of Shurima. Meaning that all the resources they have to get themselves. And so, if you live in Nazuma, you work for Nazuma, because it is in the interest of everyone to survive. Meaning that if you live here, you are likely sent out to hunt. In fact, that's the entire idea of Nazuma. These people are monster hunters. And the issue is that if you hunt here, you are facing very dangerous creatures. We are talking about animals with very abnormal abilities, where the evolution perks match an isolated nation. Not to mention, there is a very good chance some of these animals are gonna be infused with the void. And so, if you wanna be useful for Nazuma, and you might be forced to be, you have to hunt, which means you're not gonna last long here. But hey, at least there is no military, which is also technically the case for the next region, Bilgewater. Now, Bilgewater is your very typical pirate nation. It comes with the very typical benefits of a pirate nation, that being no benefit and only risks. So sure, Bilgewater is a region where you won't find any massive conflicts, at least not externally. In a way, Bilgewater functions like Piltover. It is a big trading hub, except here it is all black market, meaning nobody is really here to fight. When it comes to eternal conflicts, however, everyone is here to fight. The moment you turn your back on anyone, you are the target of a cutthroat. And if you have some change in your pocket, you are getting robbed. And if you don't, you're getting robbed of your organs. Truth be told, nowhere in Bilgewater are you really safe. Even outside of the main base city, you have wild threats and monsters, and there are the Buru with a bunch of spiritual monsters potentially. But the Buru want you to be in motion, and then we are getting back to the Nazuma situation. Not to mention occasionally you might find a demon here. And should you actually somehow find a relatively safe place here, it is just a matter of time for the harrowing to arrive. Yes, let's not forget that every year the Shadow Isles try to expand with the Black Mist. And since Bilgewater is the closest point, every year the locals fight waves of the undead here. And from the stories we got, that situation is not pretty at all. So yes, actually, literally nowhere here are you safe. Also, of course, no security, and when it comes to militarization, it is kinda automatic. You have to fight the undead. Also yes, of course, everyone owns a gun here. But this then takes us to what might be potentially the top 4 most dangerous places on Runeterra. And so next up, let's talk about Targon. Targon is interesting because in theory you could live at the bottom of the mountain in a relative peace. But the issue is, there are no laws here. And for the most part, you will be meeting a lot of criminals here. In a lot of these cases, these criminals will be coming here from different nations to escape, or they were simply sent here to be exiled. For the Demacians, this is a very traditional punishment called the Crown of Stone. So already, even the bottom of the mountain is not the safest. But even if you manage to build your own cottage here, because the entire mountain is infused with celestial magic, occasionally you might have some celestial beings coming down, not to mention dragons also live here, and on top of all of that, the land itself may just stand up and move. And yes, somehow you can also find demons here. And we are not even talking about what you can find around the peak of the mountain. Yes, it is true that some people actually live on the mountain, but those are mostly superhumans that are attuned to the celestial magic there. These people are equipped to fight powerful creatures. If you were plopped in there, the moment you walk outside of a village, you're gone. So while the external conflicts are kinda non-existent here, internally, you may find an occasional battle between the Lunari and the Solari, but more importantly, you will be fighting the wilderness constantly. It is far worse than any other nation. On top of which, I wouldn't really expect any social security or safety. You are on your own, trying to fight celestial beings as you try to herd goats. But again, no military, I guess. So what could potentially be worse than this? Well, there is one nation that is so inhabitable, you have to be a special race to survive. And that is, of course, the Freljord. Now, there are parts of the Freljord that are actually fine. So just like you are fine at the bottom of Mount Targon, you can actually live in some of the highlands of Freljord, herding goats. Sorry, the Elnuk. In fact, these two regions can have their peace index be copy-pasted. Because just like how dangerous the peaks of Targon are, the Freljordian freezing north is just as bad. It is a place where only the Iceborn can live comfortably. And even then you are constantly fighting against the wilderness. And oh boy, are the animals here massive. Also, there are Yetis. And yes, some of these creatures may also be infused with the void of the abyss. And when you are not fighting the wilderness, you are fighting the other tribes who are also trying to survive. That is, if you are even accepted into one of the tribes. Because every human being is one extra mouth to be fed. So this entire region is just constant pillaging. And so even if you don't freeze instantly because you are not an Iceborn, the chances of survival anywhere here are pretty miserable. Other than that, you can copy-paste Targon. Except the conflicts. Freljord needs to expand everywhere to survive. Which then takes us to the last two regions which are on an equal level. Simply said, if you appear here, the only way for you to survive is to get out of here. And so of course, the first of these places is the Shadow Isles. This is an island that is covered in the black mist and the undead. You do not survive here, you get out of here. There is honestly not too much to be said. Conflicts everywhere, security none. Militarization comes bundled in with the undead. And the other region is exactly like this, because we are talking about Icathia. You can copy-paste the Shadow Isles, except now, instead of the undead, you have the Voidborn. And if it is not random void creatures that are eating you, you have people whose minds were twisted. And so, you would be getting sacrificed to the Great Abyss. And that was all the regions ranked based on how much you could actually survive there. That is, besides Kamavor and all the other places that are not on the map, because they are somewhere in the east. That's probably something to be explored in the MMO. But at first glance, as you can see, while some nations may be more red than others, it is also possible that they may be safer than others. And that's because, remember, all of these stats are technically normalized to a scale. Meaning the social security and safety would have higher value than the conflicts. Because if you can't just survive there, well, what are you doing there? On top of this, these are compared to each other. Meaning that even though some regions may be in the green, they are all still pretty bad. But even with all of this said, of course, all of these are rough estimates. And I wouldn't exactly call this video an objective view. I mean, we are talking about 23 different indexes that were shoved into 3 categories, and only some of these indexes are actually relevant for Runeterra. And so, the next time you wish to be transported into another universe, first rule, don't wish for Warhammer, and secondly, if you appear on Runeterra, just go somewhere where nobody will notice you. At least that way, you either get killed by a demon, or a celestial dragon may randomly annihilate you.